On today's World Insight, China, Russia, and Afghanistan, the top agenda in a high-level in-person NATO meeting in Brussels, with the U.S. Secretary of State in attendance. Can he smooth over tensions in the alliance? And China's new space mission to boldly go where no one has gone before. What will it take to accomplish it?
From the moon, go to deep space, to Mars, to asteroid, Jupiter, and Saturn, and the founder of the solar system.
Here is our host, Tian Wei.
Hello and welcome to World Insight. I'm Tian Wei in Beijing. NATO foreign ministers gather in Brussels, and the U.S. Secretary of State Antony Blinken is there on a mission to smooth over bruised relations in the military alliance. It's the first face-to-face NATO meeting since 2019. High on the agenda are discussions over climate change, China and Russia. Blinken also seeks to consult with NATO allies on the way forward in Afghanistan. What does Biden's "America's is back" policy mean for the alliance? How welcome is U.S. re-engagement with NATO after frayed ties under Trump? Let's loop in our panelists. For the latest on the NATO meeting in Washington, D.C., Peter Kuznick, professor of history from American University, and also his colleague, Garrett Martin, senior professorial lecturer from the School of International Service from American University, co-director of the Transatlantic Policy Center. Join us in Beijing studio, Senior Colonel Joe Bo, senior fellow from the Center for International Security and Strategy from Tsinghua University. Gentlemen, welcome to the program. I want to start by asking your takeaway from the latest meeting between the U.S. official and certainly from the NATO allies. Much or more rhetorics? Professor Kuznick.
Well, the United States is trying to craft a very, very different relationship with Europe than existed under the Trump administration. From the very beginning, you have to go back, Biden is really an old Cold Warrior and a very, very strong advocate of NATO and strengthening U.S. ties to NATO. And Biden has been talking about building up U.S. relations with our allies, which Trump did a lot to damage in his 4 years in the White House. Biden is also, however, staking out a very, very confrontational policy toward Russia and toward China. So he's getting off on a deliberate first step that's going to pose, it's going to really create potentially certain problems. So what Biden is trying to do is create a united front against both Russia and China in order to make this kind of confrontational policy credible.
That's why I want to go to Mr. Martin about that. How much do you see that so-called united front that Washington wants to see really is there?
If you think of those summits as a form of international theater, I think the fact that there were no major hiccups, that you didn't have a repeat of what happened under Trump when the president routinely insulted some of his allies, had tweets that were demeaning, and created the impression of a bull in a china shop. I think on that front, it was a successful summit. Now, what happens behind closed doors? I'm sure that they had some frank discussions on the subjects where there are still disagreements. There are disagreements on issues such as Nord Stream. There are some disagreements over Afghanistan. There are sometimes some disagreements over how to deal with China. But I think the fact that they're back to a normal form where they're able to manage those disagreements behind closed doors and at least present a united front is in itself, I think, an improvement from the last 4 years. Now, whether it was delayed into sort of major policy changes down the line, that remains to be seen.
Right. Senior Colonel Zhou Bo, well, China is also busy during the time, it seems, that China is having this high-level dialogue with the Russian counterpart. Meanwhile, the Chinese president has also been exchanging greetings through envoys with the DPRK leader. So it seems that some kinds of united stance is also being formed, some suggest, from this part of the world. Is it?
I would not call it a united stance because China and Russia certainly enjoy good relationship, but short of alliance. The point is, as our Foreign Minister pointed out in January, there is no upper limit for development of China-Russian relationship. But I used to describe it as a kind of two lines in parallel. That means that however close they are, they would not overlap if they are parallel lines. But the point is, the question is how it might be driven by external force. For example, if the two lines keep on moving towards each other, maybe one day it will overlap. So the invisible hand actually is the Western hand. It's in NATO's hand probably, because NATO would also take Russia as an obvious threat, while they take China in 2019 as both opportunity and a challenge. But it's NATO. But it's interesting for me to take a notice that in Munich Security Conference, Secretary General of NATO Stoltenberg clearly called China the primary challenge. Actually, that's really surprising in that it's from a written statement, because previously Russia always is in front of China as a kind of a challenge. But this time China is the top challenge. I wonder what has happened or how they have changed their mind.
But having said that, though, it is, Professor Kuznick, as you mentioned, that Washington is so much willing to shape these two camps, the so-called United Front against China camp. But what is the result? Mr. Blinken even used China's sanction against the American officials and some of the European countries' officials as a result of the dispute over the other side's sanctioning Chinese officials first on the issue of Xinjiang Uyghur Autonomous Region, which China considered as an internal affair, used that as a united front. He said, quote, "We're in this together with the European counterpart." But how strong is that argument, though? The fact that he's even using that to show a united front somewhat also demonstrate, analysts say, the weak united front ever existed.
The situation is very complicated right now. We're in a new administration in the United States that's trying to assert itself. Biden wrote an article in Foreign Affairs magazine last year titled "Why America Must Lead Again."
Yeah.
The United States has not been leading in recent years, and there's no evidence that the world wants the United States form of leadership. And so the United States is trying to kind of force itself onto everybody's agenda now, but nobody is really reaching out to the United States to provide that kind of leadership. For example, in late December, the Europeans all agreed to this investment deal with China. Even though Sullivan had urged them to hold off on this, they ignored the US pressure and proceeded with this deal. Nobody is looking for the kind of confrontational policies that the US is trying to encourage now. So nobody wants to be put in a position where they've got to choose between the US and China. Even Japan, China's their lead, all these countries, almost all of them, China is their leading trade partner. So people are looking for a different kind of approach. They're looking for trying to find common grounds on the things that we agree on and to work constructively.
Senior Colonel Zhou, in international relations, two things, with my humble knowledge. One is real hard power. You use ultimate power to pressure the others, to coerce the others into your own camp or your own opinion. The other is the so-called soft power, that you have this image and the status of leadership, and you bring to the others a sense of hope with the actions that you take. Now, how much, from your perspective, Senior Colonel Zhou, does the United States now has with its European counterpart?
Well, in terms of hard power and soft power, it's a good question, because if we look at China's hard power, I think it is increasing tremendously. According to CNN, we even have 60 ships more than the U.S. Navy. But in terms of tonnage, we are smaller. So China's strength is definitely growing. And I believe it is fairly justifiable to say the United States is in relative decline, although they do not want to hear about that. If you look at what had happened, right? I believe the largest challenge for the 21st century is not China's peaceful rise, which is already demonstrated, but how Americans' decline could be peaceful.
Well, the decline word itself is never welcomed by Washington, of course, which is totally understand. But Mr. Martin, how much persuasive power do you think Washington today has over the European allies, particularly within a context of NATO?
That's a good question. I think the last 4 years have really scarred the European public. I think it has had a significant impact. Some surveys that were conducted in late November, December, even before January 6th, had shown a real erosion of support among the European public for the United States. I think the Europeans are far less willing to just follow the lead of the United States. You know, they might find their own interest, they might cooperate, but I think they want to be treated in a far more equitable manner than they have in the past. That being said, I think it's also very important to point out that the European public has also grown a lot more skeptical of Chinese leadership as well. So I think Europeans do not want to be forced to choose between the two sides. So the Europeans are trying to navigate their own way and their own interests, which I think is creating a lot of uncertainty on the international stage for that reason.
Now, there is a tendency, gentlemen, that political issues all of a sudden become the issues for NATO to think about. For example, about China's internal affairs, the issue of Xinjiang. The U.S. goal, of course, is to make it global, and therefore it could serve its purpose. But then the issue is whether the rest of the world want to follow that path. If that path is followed, what does it mean? Because the Europeans also have their own issues.
Yes, I mean, I think what you're seeing, and I think one of the most important elements that predates the arrival of the Biden administration, that was already set foot in the last year, I would say, a sense that the international system has changed quite dramatically in the last 4 years, let alone in the last decade. That was the last time in 2010 that NATO produced its so-called strategic concept, which is essentially its roadmap for how it sees the world and how it sees its own functions. And so I think what we are going to see in the next year now is a process by which NATO revisits its strategic concept. And looming large will be the question of how does NATO view its policy towards China.
The nature of NATO to begin with, that of course is for the Cold War against the former Soviet Union, but now it's changing. It seems that NATO is searching for its own identity anyway, while at the same time thinking about budget. So, Senior Colonel Zhou, to you, how will this way, dealing with China or talking to America about so-called common enemy like China, mean for NATO's own search of identity now?
Well, NATO in the past doesn't have a China policy. And nor does it have a China policy now, because in the past it says that it doesn't have a policy on the South China Sea or Diaoyu Islands or on Taiwan issue. But now it seems that they are more concerned with China in part because of they have found China in, quote, their backyard, for example, in the Mediterranean Sea, in Baltic Sea. But the point is we do not consider those areas to be backyard of NATO. Because if you look at the Chinese Navy, actually Chinese Navy nowadays is becoming more and more international. So why should we keep such a Navy? It's not for resolving a Taiwan issue or South China Sea issue, because we don't need so many ships for that. And China's Navy must be abroad for safeguarding China's own overseas interest and shouldering its international responsibilities. So, in concluding, China and now under NATO has a kind of working relationship at a certain level. We do not see each other, and we should not see each other as a threat.
Professor Kuznick, you've been doing research a lot on the disarmament issue. Now, that was also an interesting part of NATO's mission. But Professor Kuznick, tell me more about your thoughts. What is going to be the nature of NATO in all of this, and therefore impact on its real nature for the years to come?
There are some people who are advocating NATO rely more on its own military and its own defense. Ivo Daalder, for example, has recently called for Britain and France to extend the nuclear umbrella over Europe instead of the United States doing so. China has 2 aircraft carriers. The United States still has 11. The United States tonnage is still twice as much as China's. The United States still spends 3 times as much on its military as China does. But Fareed Zakaria surprised me in a commentary a few days ago, because he was talking about all these people who are hyping the China threat, and saying that China poses such a real threat to the United States. And he says the only ones who benefit from that are the military leaders and the defense contractors. And he says that the real threat is not that kind of threat, although I am very worried about what's happening in the Strait of Taiwan. And that is a serious problem. The South China Sea is a serious problem. So these are some serious problems. That's why we need to be talking constructively, talking in a positive way, because there is, I've heard more admirals and generals in the last weeks talking about the threat of war between the U.S. and China and the U.S. and Russia. And even the head of the U.S. Strategic Command, Admiral Richard, talking about the threat of nuclear war. And so as somebody who's committed to nuclear abolition, I mean, this really does worry me, that there is a reason why the bullet atomic scientist has the hands of the doomsday clock at 100 seconds before midnight, the closest it's ever been since the clock was started in 1947. With relations between United States and Russia, and the United States and China are at all-time low. We might say the Cuban Missile Crisis was worse, but we are in a very, very precarious situation. And for this kind of childish rhetoric, calling other leaders killers, or standing up and condemning them at the start of the meeting in Anchorage, it's the wrong footing, and that's what worries me right now.
The style is one thing. The nature of it is a totally much more important segment in our discussion. Senior Colonel Zhou, your response to Professor Kuznick's remarks.
Well, I think I almost fully agree with him, although I disagree with him in the nature of Taiwan Strait and South China Sea issue. I believe what China is trying to safeguard is China's sovereignty, over these 2 issues. So they are not external matters; they are internal matters for China.
What's going to happen to NATO? That question we really have to ask, because NATO exists for a reason. What is going to be NATO? NATO is looking at climate change issues. NATO is trying to work out the differences among its members, particularly the United States and the Europeans. And NATO is also looking at, what is going to be its role facing up to Russia, first of all, and also how to deal with China. So what is NATO right now?
A few points. I think reports of NATO's demise have been greatly exaggerated and have been done over time, multiple different times. I think you have to understand first, NATO is an incredibly versatile organization that has changed multiple times in the course of its history.
Yes.
I think that's something to keep in mind. It has great resilience because it's been through those challenges before. People tend to rapidly forget it's a military alliance and a political alliance. Therefore, the fact that it's talking about subjects like climate change, issues of resilience, pandemic, and China are completely understandable, because those are the concerns of the member states that make the alliance. So I think that shouldn't be a surprise. I would say that, again, to emphasize my previous point, I think NATO has a number of core tasks, including sort of deterrence, which it has bolstered towards Russia in the last few years because of Russia's actions in Crimea and Ukraine. I think there's greater concern, or at least attention, to China because of China's presence in Europe and the size of its investment and so forth. So I think it's entirely normal that at least China features on the agenda. Now, what kind of actions will that mean? That's not yet clear. That is to be defined. I would still be surprised if you start seeing NATO actively patrolling the South China Sea, because fundamentally most of its member states do not have the capacities to do that. But at the same time, we've seen the UK with its integrated defense review, we've seen the French and the Germans. They are paying more attention to the Indo-Pacific as a region, and that is a fact. I think it's a testament to the importance of that region in the larger world stage.
What is NATO probably has a lot to do with how is NATO or members of NATO looking at the nature of threats they're facing right now. So what is the nature of threat that do the members of the NATO look at, not the threats that others told the members of the NATO that they are facing right now? Professor Kuznick, that is a key issue here.
Well, I'm not thinking of it so much in terms of threats, but they think of it in terms of threats, and they think that Russia has been acting very, very badly and in very dangerous ways. The U.S. said that the main threats to the United States are no longer international terrorism. The main threats now are Russia and China. And the United States has been adopting an increasingly hostile stance since that point, or even before in some ways. So we know that Jens Stoltenberg, the Secretary General of NATO, thinks a lot about China and wants NATO to become more involved in dealing with the Indo-Pacific, as Garrett had said. So they see a dual threat, but there are other things that NATO's dealing with. We haven't really talked about Afghanistan. We haven't talked about Libya. We haven't talked really. We've mentioned that NATO is concerned about climate change. The United States is very concerned, even from the standpoint of bases. China has 3 bases around the world. The United States has 800. But some of those bases are being seriously threatened by global warming and the rising sea levels, including Norfolk, which is the biggest naval base in the world, is now underwater much of the time. Annapolis, we've got many of these. Alaska, bases are being threatened, so they need to deal with that. And they're also trying to deal with the other problems resulting from climate change. How do the NATO forces in Afghanistan and Iraq deal with this temperatures that are well over 100 degrees and are affecting the NATO missions? So that would be a positive thing for NATO to deal with, is climate change. And I'd rather see NATO deal with problems like that and take a less militaristic response. NATO did expand in Eastern Europe in recent years. And so NATO is searching for its identity and a sense of its mission. But, and as Garrett was saying, this still is to be determined.
Right. Senior Colonel Zhou Bo.
Well, I think NATO can still survive, but it won't thrive, simply because the bigger it becomes, the less coherent it might be, because for military alliance to survive, it needs to have a threat, a very big threat. And not even Russia is such a big threat. If you consider NATO has 3 nuclear weapon states, and if you consider the GDP of European countries together is 20 times that of Russia, if you consider Russia's economy is basically at the level of Italy or Spain, so some small threats, for example, like a terrorism, would not justify such existence. And internally speaking, Turkey is actually becoming at odds with NATO, being the second largest military. So its self-importance for NATO is self-evident. But Turkey called to buy Chinese weapons, Turkey bought a Russian weapon, and Turkey is having quarrel with all other members. So NATO doesn't have a bright future. It can survive, but it won't thrive.
Very interesting point. Now, my last point, and very briefly from every one of you, this is still an evolving picture. We might not have a conclusion today, and we might not have a conclusion even a year from now. Only probably years from now can we know what we are saying today is really relevant for the result. But this is a very important debate. So before we go, tell me personally, how do you see the role of NATO and its likely relationship with the United States, which is a member of NATO. Mr. Martin.
Well, first of all, I do have to respectfully disagree with Colonel Zhao that NATO is a political alliance as well. It does not necessarily need a large threat. And I think it's actually a strength of NATO that it's able to deal with internal disagreement. Okay. I was a historian by training, and the country where I grew up, France, left NATO, and still NATO survived and was able to go forward. In terms of the future for NATO, I think, again, it has built-in resilience and the experience of dealing with those challenges. I think that there is also now more will from Washington and others to at least try and patch those differences. I don't want to downplay them. There is a serious lack of political cohesion at present, but I am pretty confident that NATO will survive and do well in the forthcoming years. Okay,
Professor Kuznick, your thoughts?
Well, I'm not sure what Garrett means by doing well, but
up to interpretation, gentlemen.
We'll discuss that afterwards. But I see NATO moving forward as striking out a more independent path from the United States, a less belligerent path. As a political alliance, it can do some very positive things, and can help to tamp down and diffuse some of the tensions.
Okay.
I think that France and Germany are moving in that direction. England, Boris Johnson, I'm not so sure about. The recent statements I've seen from Boris Johnson talks about significantly increasing Britain's nuclear arsenal, making British military capabilities much more lethal. He uses that word. So there are going to be splits within NATO. And it's, as Professor Martin says, NATO is likely to survive. It's resilient.
Yeah.
But I'm just hoping it can play a positive role and not just survive.
Okay. Senior Colonel Zhou Bo, China is not a member of NATO. China is more observing from afar. Tell me more about your thoughts.
Well, I think one of the commentators' opinion is right. NATO is political. But why it is political? Since this, by and large, is essentially a military organization, I think the shift of focus from military to political affairs is because NATO is really not having much to do. For example, like climate change. Of course, everybody talks about climate change. What does NATO have anything to do with climate change? And its concern for climate change is just like my concern and your concern for climate change. So finally, I would just quote probably Mr. Putin's remarks to to American president, I wish NATO good health.
Oh, okay. We see very different opinions out there. Certainly, it's going to be quite something to be worked out in the near future. Thank you so much for every one of you in this very constructive and intellectual debate. Peter Kuznick, Garrett Martin, last but certainly not least, Senior Colonel Zhou Bo. Really appreciate it, gentlemen. Thank you so much. You're watching World Insight. Coming up, China's new space mission to boldly go where no one has gone before. What will it take to accomplish it? We will be back with answers.
From the moon, go to deep space, to Mars, to asteroid, and Jupiter, and Saturn, and to the founder of the solar system.
World Insight with Tian Wei. Go beyond the headlines. This is World Insight. I'm Tian Wei. China has steadily made progress on humanity's last frontier. In 2013, China became the third country to successfully make a soft landing on the moon with its Chang'e 3 rover. 6 years later, in 2019, Chang'e 4's landing on the dark side of the moon is a milestone in exploring our nearest celestial neighbor up close. Last year, Chang'e 5 returned to Earth with more than 1,000 grams of lunar soil, making China the third country to ever do that. After more than a decade of lunar exploration, a new frontier, deep space exploration, is now on the national agenda. Earlier, I talked to Wu Ji, the former Director General of the National Space Science Center of the Chinese Academy of Sciences. He said China should push the boundaries of its deep space exploration and venture further into the unknown. He's also a science fiction writer. Let's listen to what he had to say to brief us with the latest. Congratulations on your book, Lunar Hotel. Wow, that's quite a popular book, not only in China, but also in other parts of the world now.
Yes, it was published 1 year ago in Chinese version. So I have a very good friend. He volunteered to translate it into French. L'Hôtel de la Mer, de Plus.
Let me ask you, Mr. Wu, about some of the latest development in deep exploration. You've been arguing through China's 2 sessions that it is extremely crucial. Tell me why.
Yes, deep space exploration is a new area for China. We have initiated lunar exploration about 15 years ago, 16 years ago. Then we succeed with 3 steps. Orbiting the moon and landing on the moon and the sample return from the moon. We have just obtained 1,700 grams lunar soil from the moon. So this was very successful. And for the near future, we are going to go out from the moon, go to deep space, to Mars, and even further to asteroid and Jupiter and Saturn and to the boundary of the solar system. So that will be our plan in the next 15 years. Several other countries are also coming in. Of course, United States is the leading force in deep space exploration. They have launched many missions to Mars, very successful missions to Mars. And recently, beside the United States, European Space Agency, Russian, Japan, India, and even UAE, United Arab Emirates, they also have their Mars missions. So China would like to be one member of this club. And this is very exciting for the younger generation of China. So they are looking forward to the outer space.
But some could argue, Mr. Wu, you could well put the money into deep sea exploration, into other areas that would bring, in fact, similar opportunities for further exploration about the world, and also the byproduct, scientific byproduct that would benefit both China and the world. So why is China, as everybody else, so fascinated by the outer space? We could well do it on the other directions.
When we say deep space exploration or space science, it's just one more dimension. It doesn't mean it will replace the deeper sea exploration. So China is the economic quantity of China is larger now. So there's a possibility to cover all these areas. So we should not miss deep space exploration. On the other hand, when you look at the universe, you will think of yourself. For example, if you go to the moon, and when you're standing on the moon, you're looking back to our Earth, you will see the Earth is so beautiful. You will look at yourself from another point of view, from universe, look at yourself. So the human beings are really with one shared future. You don't see any boundary of countries. You don't really like people are fighting on the Earth, because Earth is so beautiful and you feel you have to protect it. So when you go out, you have different feelings.
Yeah.
And if you go further outside of the solar system, you will think about, is there any other intelligent life there? So if there's other intelligent life there, how could we communicate? Can we learn something from them? So all this open human beings' mind. And for young people, this is a trigger for them to think about the Earth, the human beings, the future, their future. So it's much wider dimension for the young people.
Right. Mr. Wu, for example, latest the studies about the quantum physics has been providing all of us new clues about the directions of outer space exploration and how is it related to many other areas of human life. So, Mr. Wu, how do you think these new discoveries in other areas that could help with the outer space exploration? It seems that the speed has really, it seems that it's really speeding up.
Yes, it's true. Quantum physics are developing since last century, beginning of last century. It's really fascinating. We don't really understand much of it. Even now, after 100 years, more than 100 years, it is so fascinating. It is so different from the classical physics. So this must be related with the human beings, with the universe. But there are a lot of unknowns. For example, the entanglement. We have launched a satellite. It's called quantum physics, quantum experiments in space scale, and it has demonstrated that if you distribute to a pair of entangled photons 1,000 kilometers away, they are still remaining entanglement. So if you operate one of them, the other will react in the real time, instantly. So this is cannot be understood with a classical physics. And if you use this principle into the outer space, there will be a lot of infinite unknowns. So, but we are still at the very beginning.
Mr. Wu, there's also the question about, science fiction decades ago, for example, many of the things it described and now have become true. And people are wondering whether the science fictions, a lot of stories within it today will eventually become the realities of tomorrow. And therefore they say, oh, maybe science fiction writers, some of them could even, in a way, being prophet, as they say. What do you mean? How do you see this kind of discussion?
Yes, it is true. In the science fiction, there are one branch. It's called near future science fiction. So when you talk about near future science fiction, is when the writer writes it, they have an idea of what could be realized in the near future, 50 years, 100 years. So, but when the development, when the science and technology develop so fast, as what we are facing now, some 50 years of fiction can be true in 20 years. So it can really help people to realize with modern technology to realize it faster. So what I am writing in the book Lunar Hotel, all the technology there is almost ready, although you don't see them right now. But there's no blockage to realize them. It's only money. It's only time. So those things can be realized faster. Maybe in 20 years, we will build, not only Chinese, other people will build a hotel on the moon. This can be even faster. So I'm predicting 20 years, but maybe it can be realized in 15 years. So with the fast development. So you have to, you don't really, writing nothing is something it can be realized.
From the real future now back to reality, from scenarios now, Professor Wu, now come to reality. China has been working on the innovation area, has been encouraging innovation from the country itself. How do you see the realities that China is facing and the necessities of doing it?
We are in a period of a new era. We after this 13th 5 years plan. We are now opening a new chapter of a 14th 5 years plan, and China is aiming to be within the front row of innovative country in 2035. So in 15 years, China will be more advanced. All this will encourage the young people, the young generation, and of course, including us, to do much better. And in the past 20 years, most of the time we are following the advanced technology of the world. We are learning, we are following, we even sometimes copy. But now we feel that we have to invent something, we have to create something. So innovation is much important for us. If we don't innovate, if we don't create new frontiers, we cannot move forward because we are almost there. We are almost very close to the frontiers. So we have to lead the world. China has the responsibility to lead.
And now, of course, there's the issue of 卡脖子, isn't it? Mainly that China, as a result of geopolitics and many other reasons, will be not necessarily having access to some of the latest technologies. Mr. Wu, how do you see this reality? And what do you think are the most urgent issues that China really have to work on in order to overcome this difficult period of time?
It is true that there are some countries in the world. I should say United States is the leading country to block China. In the area I am working, space technology, space science and technology, we have been blocked by the U.S. for 20 years. They had called Wolf law from the Congress. They blocked China, blocked their own scientists and industry to collaborate with China in space technology, even space science. When we go to an international conference, we cannot talk with the NASA people, with the U.S. people, space people, bilaterally. They have to, when we talk, they have to ask the third party to come, a European or Japanese to come and make it multilateral. If we talk only bilateral, they are breaking their laws. But for China, we are open. There's no problem for us. We can talk with them. So we have been blocked by the U.S. for more than 15 years, but still we are developing. So it's not a threat. It will give us some difficulties, but finally we can go forward, no problem. We will not stop there. We will not, because of this, we will not stop with our development. For example, the recent completion of navigation system, of Chinese navigation system, Beidou system, all the components on board of the satellite are made in China. So we can do that by our own technology.
That was my talk with Mr. Wu Ji, a science fiction writer, but also a very well-known outer space expert from China. That's all we have for today. If you'd like to see more, search World Insight or check out our YouTube channel. Follow us on Twitter and Facebook. I'm Tian Wei on behalf of the team. Thanks for watching, and bye for now.